Early in the morning of September 26, 1983, inside a classified Soviet command facility, the lights never went out. There were no windows, no clocks on the walls, only screens, control panels, and men trained to act within minutes if the world began to end. That night, there were no explosions, no aircraft crossing borders, no declaration of war. But on one screen, the Soviet early warning system delivered a cold conclusion. Intercontinental ballistic missiles had been launched from the United States. An alarm sounded. Indicators shifted to emergency status. According to the system, this was not a theory or a projection. It was a confirmed detection. A sequence of procedures designed for this exact scenario began to unfold automatically, without emotion and without hesitation. In the early 1980s, doubt was considered dangerous. Hesitation could be interpreted as failure. Absolute trust in the system was not just a technical requirement. It was the backbone of nuclear deterrence. If the machine said an attack had begun, human operators were trained not to question it. Because if you doubted and were wrong, you could lose everything in minutes. The system existed because both sides of the Cold War shared the same fear, a surprise first strike. The belief that the enemy might launch without warning, and that any delay in response could mean annihilation. To prevent that, superpowers built machines designed to react faster than human thought. Machines that did not feel fear. Machines that did not hesitate. Machines that did not ask why. That is why the people inside these rooms were not selected for creativity or imagination. They were chosen for discipline, for obedience, for their ability to follow procedure precisely and place the system above personal judgment. On the night of September 26, 1983, the system was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It detected light patterns. It processed satellite data. It interpreted the signals as a missile launch. And it demanded human confirmation so the next level of command could act. On paper, the human role was simple. Not to decide the fate of the world, only to confirm that the system was working as intended. But at that moment, one officer faced a decision no manual had prepared him for. To trust the system, as everything around him insisted, or to trust the sense that something about the warning did not add up. No one in that room knew they were standing at one of the narrowest edges in human history. No one, except the officer on duty, understood that a single report, sent or withheld, could change the world forever. The system had issued its command. But that night, one man chose not to follow it. And because of that decision, the world woke up the next morning still alive. Under normal circumstances, a warning like this would have been unthinkable. But September 1983 was not a normal moment in the Cold War. In the weeks leading up to that night, the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union had reached one of its most fragile points since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Trust was not just low, it was practically non-existent. Each side assumed the worst intentions from the other, and every military movement was interpreted through the lens of imminent confrontation. Earlier that same month, a Soviet interceptor had shot down a civilian airliner that had strayed into restricted airspace. The incident killed everyone on board and immediately escalated tensions with the West. In Washington, the event was condemned as proof of Soviet recklessness. In Moscow, leaders believed the aircraft might have been a deliberate provocation, or worse, a reconnaissance mission disguised as a civilian flight. At the same time, NATO was preparing for large-scale military exercises designed to test command readiness. On paper, these drills were defensive, but to Soviet intelligence, they looked dangerously similar to rehearsals for a real nuclear strike. History had taught them that surprise was the greatest weapon their adversary possessed. This was the atmosphere in which the Soviet early warning system was expected to perform flawlessly. The logic of nuclear deterrence depended on speed. If one side launched first, the other had only minutes to detect the attack, verify it, and respond. Any hesitation could mean total destruction. That belief shaped every layer of military doctrine. It shaped training manuals. It shaped careers. It shaped fear. Inside the command structure, responsibility was deliberately fragmented. No single person was supposed to feel like they carried the fate of the world alone. Data moved upward. Decisions moved downward. Each link in the chain was expected to do its part and nothing more. But that structure also created a dangerous psychological trap. If something went wrong, the safest option for an individual officer was often to follow procedure exactly as written. Disobeying orders carried immediate, personal consequences. Questioning the system could be interpreted as incompetence or insubordination. In a rigid hierarchy, uncertainty was not rewarded. The system itself had been designed with that mindset in mind. It was built to reduce ambiguity, not to invite debate. When an alert was triggered, it presented a conclusion, not question. The human operator's role was not to investigate motives or probabilities. It was to confirm what the machine had already determined. That is what made false alarms so dangerous. A real attack and a false one looked nearly identical in the first moments. Both began with signals on a screen. Both demanded rapid confirmation. Both created a race against time in which restraint could feel indistinguishable from failure. On the night of September 26th, the pressure inside the command center was not theoretical. It was immediate and physical. Every second that passed without confirmation could be interpreted as delay. Every delay increased the risk that higher command would be left blind at the worst possible moment. Outside the bunker, the world was asleep. Cities were quiet. Families had no idea how close they were to becoming targets. Inside, a small group of officers operated under the assumption that the enemy might already be preparing to erase them. The most dangerous aspect of that moment was not the technology. It was expectation. The system expected to be trusted. The chain of command expected obedience. The political climate expected hostility. There was no institutional expectation for someone to say, "This doesn't feel right." Years of doctrine had trained officers to believe that hesitation was the greatest sin in nuclear war, that waiting for perfect certainty could be fatal, that machines were necessary precisely because human intuition was slow, emotional, and unreliable. And yet, that same doctrine quietly ignored one uncomfortable truth. Machines could also be wrong. The system in place was relatively new. It relied on satellite detection and automated interpretation of visual data. Engineers understood its limitations, but those limitations were rarely discussed in operational settings. Once the system was deployed, it became authoritative by default. In that environment, questioning the alarm was not just risky, it was abnormal. That is the pressure that filled the room that night. Not panic, not chaos, but a disciplined, suffocating expectation that the system knew better than any individual inside it. What followed was not a dramatic countdown. It was something far more unsettling, a quiet moment in which one person realized that doing nothing might be more dangerous and more necessary than doing exactly what he had been trained to do. And that realization came with no reassurance, no validation, and no guarantee that he would be proven right. Only the knowledge that if he was wrong, history would never forgive him. The man sitting at the center of that decision was not a general. He was not a politician. He was not someone whose name was expected to appear in history books. His name was Stanislav Petrov. Petrov was a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, assigned to monitor the country's early warning satellite system. His job was not to launch missiles, and it was not to decide policy. His role was procedural. Analyze incoming data, classify the threat level, and report upward so higher command could act. In theory, that separation was meant to reduce risk. No single individual should feel responsible for the fate of the world. In practice, it meant that Petrov's judgment would shape everything that followed. Petrov was not new to the system. He had been involved in its development and training phases. He understood not only how it was supposed to work, but also how it could fail. He knew the system was young, recently deployed, and still untested under real-world conditions. That knowledge was not comforting. It was isolating. The early warning network relied on satellites positioned to detect the heat signatures of missile launches. When a system flagged a launch, it did so with mathematical confidence. But Petrov understood that confidence was not the same as certainty. Data still had to be interpreted. Signals still had to make sense. Shortly after midnight, the first alert appeared. According to the system, a missile had been launched from the United States. One missile. That detail mattered. Petrov immediately recognized the inconsistency. A real nuclear first strike would not begin with a single missile. The entire logic of deterrence depended on overwhelming force. No strategist would gamble global war on one launch. It would make no sense tactically or politically. Moments later, the system escalated the warning. Then another missile. Then another. 5 launches in total. The room grew tense but still controlled. This was not panic. This was procedure unfolding exactly as designed. Each new alert reinforced the previous one. Each signal pushed the situation closer to a point of no return. But to Petrov, the pattern only deepened the contradiction. 5 missiles were still not enough. Not for a real attack. Not for the end of the world. At the same time, other expected confirmations were missing. Ground-based radar had not yet detected incoming objects. There was a delay where there should not have been one. The data was incomplete, fragmented, and oddly selective. Petrov understood something else as well. If he reported the alarm as genuine, the responsibility would shift upward instantly. Higher command would have only minutes to decide whether to retaliate. Once the process began, it would be almost impossible to stop. If he reported it as a false alarm and he was wrong, the consequences would be catastrophic. Not just for the country, for him personally. He could be court-martialed. He could be imprisoned. He could be remembered as the man who hesitated while his nation burned. This was not a heroic moment. There was no confidence, no certainty, only incomplete data, professional instinct, and a crushing awareness of what both options implied. Petrov later described the moment as deeply uncomfortable. He did not feel like a savior. He felt like someone being forced to gamble without knowing the odds. He was acutely aware that the system, the hierarchy, and the political climate all pointed in one direction. Trust the machine. Report the launch. Let the process continue. Instead, Petrov chose to delay. He classified the alert as a false alarm and reported uncertainty rather than confirmation. It was not a refusal to act. It was a refusal to escalate. He waited. Minutes passed. Then more. No impacts were detected. No confirmations arrived. The radar remained silent. Gradually, the terrifying possibility dissolved into an explanation no one wanted to confront. The system had been wrong. The cause would later be traced to a rare alignment of sunlight reflecting off clouds, misinterpreted by satellite sensors as missile launches. A flaw no one had fully anticipated. A failure hidden inside layers of automation and confidence. That night, Petrov was not rewarded. He was questioned. He was criticized for paperwork errors. The incident was quietly buried. The system survived intact. So did the world. But the most unsettling part of the story is not that the machine failed. It is that the machine failed exactly as it was allowed to fail. Silently, confidently, and without room for disagreement. And the only reason it did not end everything was because one man chose to trust his judgment more than the system he was ordered to obey. What mattered most in that moment was not the alarm itself, but what happened after it. In nuclear command systems, the first alert is only the beginning. What follows is a sequence designed to move faster than doubt. Once an attack is classified as real, the information flows upward immediately, narrowing the time available for human judgment at every level. Petrov understood this better than anyone in the room. If he confirmed the alert, even with reservations, the system would not pause to debate probabilities. It would do what it was designed to do: accelerate. Senior officers would be notified. Strategic forces would be placed on higher readiness. Decision-makers, already primed by months of tension, will be forced to choose between retaliation or annihilation. There would be no space to revisit his reasoning. No opportunity to reverse course. No way to say, wait. That is the illusion built into automated deterrence. The belief that each step is reversible, when in reality, each confirmation removes the option to stop. Inside the command center, The atmosphere remained controlled, but the weight of expectation was unmistakable. Procedures existed for almost every scenario, but none for hesitation. There was no protocol titled, "If your intuition disagrees with the machine." Petrov was expected to deliver a clear assessment. Attack confirmed, or attack denied. Nothing in between. But the data still refused to align. The system insisted on certainty, yet the supporting signals lagged behind. The warning made sense only if the machine was infallible, and Petrov knew it was not. He also knew something else. Systems like this were built on political assumptions as much as technical ones. They assumed rational behavior from both sides. They assumed no leader would initiate nuclear war with anything less than overwhelming force. And they assumed that humans would always trust the machine when time ran out. That assumption was now being tested. Petrov made his decision quietly. There was no announcement, no dramatic declaration. He reported the alarm as a false signal and logged uncertainty rather than confirmation. In doing so, he interrupted the chain at its most fragile point. This was not defiance in the traditional sense. He did not refuse an order. He followed the rules as loosely as they would allow. But even that small deviation carried enormous risk. For several minutes, nothing happened. The system continued to display warnings, but the consequences stalled. Higher command was not yet forced into action. The world hung in a suspended state, balanced between automation and restraint. Those minutes were the most dangerous part of the night. If missiles were truly on the way, every second of delay made the situation worse. If Petrov was wrong, history would judge his hesitation as catastrophic negligence. And yet, the silence outside the bunker continued. No impacts, no confirmations, no radar signatures. Eventually, the alerts were downgraded. The emergency state dissolved not with relief, but with confusion. What had appeared so certain moments earlier now looked increasingly fragile. The realization spread slowly. The system had produced a confident conclusion based on incomplete information. The crisis ended not with a decisive action, but with the absence of one. No retaliation was ordered. No missiles were launched. No leaders were awakened in panic. The chain of escalation had been stopped at its first human link. What remained was an uncomfortable truth that no one in that room could easily confront. The system they were trained to trust had nearly pushed them into a war that no one intended to start. And the only thing that prevented it was a decision that the system itself was never designed to allow. Petrov had not saved the world by acting. He had saved it by choosing not to act, when everything around him demanded that he should. The most dangerous phase of the incident did not end when the alarm stopped. It began after nothing happened. In nuclear systems, silence is not reassurance. It is uncertainty. For several minutes after Petrov reported the alert as a false signal, there was no external confirmation to prove him right. No explosions, no radar contacts, but also no definitive proof that the attack had never existed. Those minutes stretched longer than any procedure allowed for. Petrov remained at his post, aware that the responsibility had not passed. If new data appeared, even a single confirmation, the decision would snap back in the opposite direction. The system was still armed with expectation, even if the immediate escalation had stalled. Inside the room, the pressure shifted. It was no longer about reacting quickly. It was about waiting, something the system was never built to do well. Waiting created space for doubt. Waiting created fear. Waiting forced everyone to confront the possibility that the machine had spoken with confidence and been wrong. This was the moment when Petrov's decision became truly irreversible. If the alert had been real, the delay he introduced would have left the Soviet Union with less time to respond. That possibility weighed heavily on him. He knew that if missiles suddenly appeared on radar, there would be no explanation strong enough to justify his earlier judgment. He would not be remembered as cautious. He would be remembered as responsible for failure. That was the personal cost of restraint in a system designed to reward speed. As the minutes passed, additional data arrived. Ground-based radar continued to show nothing. No objects entering airspace. No signatures consistent with an incoming strike. The absence of confirmation began to matter more than the original alert. Slowly, the balance shifted. What had initially appeared as certainty began to look like error. The system's confidence started to erode under the weight of reality. What it had detected was not an attack, but a misinterpretation. Sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds, aligned in a way the satellite sensors had never been fully tested against. The explanation was technical. The consequences could have been final. Once the alert was officially classified as false, the immediate danger passed. But the atmosphere inside the command center did not relax. There was no celebration, no relief, only the quiet recognition of how close the system had come to forcing a decision no one truly wanted to make. Petrov was not praised for his judgment. He was questioned. His actions were reviewed. His reports were scrutinized not for wisdom, but for procedural compliance. The focus was not on what almost happened, but on what rules had been bent. That response revealed something unsettling. The system was far more comfortable accepting a near disaster than admitting its own vulnerability. It was easier to criticize the human operator than to confront the idea that the machine itself could mislead with such authority. The incident was quietly classified. No public acknowledgement followed. No lesson was shared beyond closed rooms. The world went on, unaware that its survival had depended on a decision that officially never mattered. For Petrov, the night did not end in recognition. It ended in silence. He returned to his routine, knowing that the system would continue to operate largely unchanged. The same assumptions, the same expectations, the same demand for trust. And that was perhaps the most troubling outcome of all, because the machinery of nuclear deterrence had not failed in a dramatic way. It had failed in the most dangerous way possible, by nearly succeeding without ever being questioned. And it would not be the last time. In the months that followed, the night of September 26, 1983, did not become a turning point, at least not publicly. There were no press conferences, no official admissions, no sweeping reforms announced to the world. The Soviet Union did not tell its citizens that nuclear war had been narrowly avoided. In fact, most people inside the system were never meant to know how close it had come. The incident was classified, absorbed into internal reviews and technical reports. Engineers examined sensor data. Analysts adjusted parameters. Quiet corrections were made to reduce the likelihood of similar misinterpretations. But the core philosophy remained intact. The system was still trusted. Automation was still prioritized. Speed was still valued over hesitation. From an institutional perspective, that made sense. Deterrence depended on credibility. Acknowledging how fragile the system really was could undermine confidence, not just internally, but in the eyes of an adversary. If the machine appeared uncertain, the entire balance of fear could collapse. So the lesson was not framed as the system nearly caused a catastrophe. It was framed as the system worked, and human judgment helped manage an anomaly. That distinction mattered. Petrov himself did not benefit from the outcome. His career did not advance because of the incident. In some ways, it stalled. He was criticized for failing to follow reporting procedures precisely. The paperwork mattered more than the implications of what had almost happened. This response reflected a deeper truth about command systems. They're designed to minimize deviation, not reward independent judgment. A person who questions the system, even successfully, introduces unpredictability, and unpredictability is dangerous to hierarchical control. Yet among strategists and engineers, the implications were impossible to ignore. The event exposed a critical weakness in nuclear deterrence logic. The entire framework assumed that automated systems would reduce human error. But in doing so, they introduced a new kind of risk, false certainty. Machines could generate conclusions faster than humans could challenge them, and those conclusions carried institutional authority. The idea of human in the loop began to gain more attention, not as a moral argument, but as a technical necessity. Someone had to be empowered not just to confirm, but to doubt. Someone had to be allowed to slow the process down when signals did not align with reality. The irony was clear. The more advanced the system became, the more dangerous its mistakes could be. Petrov's decision revealed something that doctrine had tried to suppress. Nuclear stability was not guaranteed by technology alone. It relied on individuals who were willing to accept personal risk in order to prevent systemic failure. That was not a comfortable conclusion for any military organization, because it meant admitting that peace had survived not because everything worked as planned, but because one person had chosen to step outside the plan. And it raised a question no system could easily answer. If the same situation happened again, would the next person be allowed to hesitate? For years, the night of September 26, 1983, remained buried in classified files. There was no public record, no acknowledgement that the world had come close to nuclear war because of a technical error. Even within military circles, the incident was rarely discussed. It existed as a footnote in internal documents, stripped of emotion and urgency. Only after the Cold War began to loosen its grip did fragments of the story emerge. As archives slowly opened and former officers spoke more freely, the outline of that night became visible. Analysts began to reconstruct what had happened, not from dramatic testimony, but from timelines, logs, and procedural records. What they found was unsettling. The system had behaved exactly as designed. The data had flowed correctly. The alarms had triggered on schedule. And yet the conclusion had been wrong. This forced historians and defense experts to confront a difficult reality. The danger had not come from reckless leaders or aggressive intent. It had come from a normal night, a functioning system, and an assumption that automation equaled reliability. The person who prevented escalation had not been empowered by doctrine. He had acted in a gray zone the system preferred to ignore. His judgment had filled a gap no algorithm could cover. When a story finally reached a broader audience, it challenged a long-standing narrative of nuclear stability. The balance of terror was often portrayed as precise and controlled, a careful equilibrium maintained by rational actors and advanced technology. The truth was far less reassuring. Stability had depended on moments of restraint that were never guaranteed, on individuals who chose caution when the system demanded certainty, on silence where noise was expected. Petrov himself was uncomfortable with the attention when it finally came. He did not present his actions as heroic. He described them as instinctive, imperfect, and deeply stressful. He emphasized that he had been unsure, that he had guessed, not known. That admission mattered more than any medal, because it revealed something fundamental about nuclear command systems. At their most critical moment, they do not eliminate uncertainty. They concentrate it into the hands of one person at one time with no margin for error. The delayed recognition of the incident did not come with sweeping reform. It came with reflection, with questions that could not be easily answered. How many similar moments had occurred without being noticed? How many decisions had gone the other way, simply because someone followed procedure? History offered no clear count. What was clear was that the safety of the world had rested, briefly and invisibly, on a decision that was never supposed to be made. And that realization lingered far longer than the alarm itself. When the alarm sounded on September 26, 1983, the system did exactly what it was built to do. It detected, interpreted, and demanded action. There was no malfunction in how it behaved. The failure lay in what it assumed. It assumed that speed was always safer than hesitation. It assumed that certainty could be engineered. It assumed that trust in automation was more reliable than human judgment. That night exposed the cost of those assumptions. Nuclear deterrence was designed to remove emotion from decision-making, to replace fear and instinct with calculation and procedure. But in doing so, it created a new vulnerability, a world in which a false signal could carry the same authority as a real attack. The system did not ask whether the warning made sense. It only asked whether it had been triggered. What prevented catastrophe was not a safeguard built into the machine. It was a human decision to slow down a process designed to move faster than thought. Petrov did not defy the system out of bravery. He did it out of discomfort, out of the recognition that something did not align with logic or experience. He acted without certainty, knowing that he might be wrong, and that the consequences of being wrong would be irreversible. That is the paradox at the center of modern command systems. They are built to eliminate doubt, yet they rely on individuals to manage uncertainty when the system fails. They promise control, yet they concentrate risk into moments where no one is meant to hesitate. The world did not change overnight after 1983. Automated warning systems continued to expand. Technology became faster, more complex, and more autonomous. The same logic that nearly triggered disaster was refined, not abandoned. And that makes this story enduring, because the question it raises has not been resolved. As machines take on greater authority in decisions of life and death, who is allowed to say no? Who is permitted to pause a process designed to never stop? The night of September 26, 1983, is not remembered for what happened. It is remembered for what it not. History survived not because the system was flawless, but because one person chose not to trust it. And the most unsettling truth is this: the system still expects to be believed. But this was not the only moment when a single human decision stood between routine procedure and irreversible catastrophe. In the next episode, we follow another night, another command room, and another Soviet officer who was ordered to act and chose not to. Next, one Soviet officer refused to launch, and the world never knew. Was that refusal an act of courage, or the last quiet barrier before nuclear war? If you believe history is shaped by moments like this, moments that were never meant to be noticed, leave a comment with your thoughts and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter in this series. Because some of the most important decisions in human history were made in silence.